And as we showed within that subset of roughly 40,000 cows, we saw that cows were more likely to get pregnant by 90. They were more likely to have more milk by 90. And they were also less likely to leave by 90 days. Dairy wellness profit dollars, DWP increased. So that relationship that we expected did show through in these results within this paper.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. I'm Reagan Bluel with the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and our guest today has a long history of serving the dairy industry. Dr. Michael Overton has been currently working with Zoetis to better understand the metabolic associations with this complicated bovine beast. He's well written with several papers published over his vast tenure, but the most current article in press that we're focused in on today from the Journal of Dairy Science is a massive data set of over 109,000 cows in this retrospective observational study that's really focused in on examining these associations between how long she was open before she got bred, how long her dry period was, and other relevant factors such as genomic testing. These impacts on lactation and ultimately making you a profit on your dairy. So, Dr. Overton, welcome to the Dairy Science Digest. Could you please take a moment just to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Reagan. I am Dr. Michael Overton. I'm a veterinarian by training. As you mentioned, I am currently at Zoetis. I've been at Zoetis 5 years now, but I've got a long career split between 8 or 9 years in private practice, doing mostly dairy work. I had about 13 years in academia, split between University of California, Davis and University of Georgia. And then I spent about 8 years at Elanco prior to coming over to Zoetis. Throughout my career, though, I've been focused heavily on trying to anticipate and answer questions that hopefully will help producers' bottom line and help them make better decisions going forward.
I'm really excited to go through this paper. And guys, this is an open access paper through the journal. And so I highly recommend for everyone listening to take a moment to go to the show notes. There's a clickable link to the paper because there's a lot of really good graphics as we talk through these associations. They're color coded and they do a fantastic job really kind of explaining some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. I think before we get started, it would be good due diligence to just talk a little bit about the difference between association versus causation. And then maybe even putting in a disclaimer about possible selection bias in this data set.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's interesting you bring that up. I was actually chatting with someone earlier today and talking about the difference between causation and correlation, because correlation is not necessarily causation.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, association doesn't necessarily say causation. So when we do retrospective observational studies, we're literally looking at data that's been collected from animals that calved or were born or whatever the situation was sometime in the past. And we're following those animals through time and observing outcomes. And we try to look at the associations between some type of variable of interest and an outcome that we're interested in evaluating. Now, association is not the same as causation because we don't know that the associations we reported are directly causative of the outcome. They could have been circumstantial, they could have been just happenstance. So we're careful when we describe this as associations versus saying X caused Y.
Mm-hmm.
To get into the causation, you really probably need to do a different type of study than retrospective observational, just because of the potential for bringing in confounders and so forth, and a better ability to clarify that going forward.
And so the data that, as described, was kind of broken into two groups, so to speak. There was one major data set that had 60 herds from across 16 different states across the nation. It was just trying to capture those progressive, high-producing herds. And then the second grouping that was also analyzed was what you call gen cows, or animals or herds that are doing genetic analysis. Do you want to talk a little bit about genetic analysis?
Yeah, okay. So genomic testing has been around since about 2012, and it's a technology that producers are gravitating to more and more. They're seeing the benefits of the genomic testing and the predictions that come from that in terms of being able to identify animals that might have higher potential for greater livability, longevity, production, lower risk of disease. These things now are showing up in the genomic test. And while those tests are not perfect, they provide some of the best predictive information we have before we have the opportunity to actually observe the phenotypes or how these animals actually perform in the dairy.
A quote that I definitely want to bring to the light in the ears of the listeners is according to the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, the annual rates of genetic gain has doubled due to this genomic selection in Holstein since 2009. I thought that was an amazing quote from your paper. And we see that progress. We see the improvement in the Holstein breed. Well, all breeds really, but this is focused on Holstein. And we're watching that beautiful bovine beast advance at a rate that's almost hard to wrap your head around, right? And a lot of the momentum initially started with some of these genomic testing opportunities. So really neat to talk about that. And I know some of the data that we're looking at, you look at both the broader set and then you look at the genetic set. And so we'll try to differentiate those as we respond to the different questions going through. So when you're advising different herds about utilizing the Dairy Wellness Profit Index, what sort of suggestions do you have for those herds?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So I'm going to go back to a quote you pulled out of the paper that I wanted to kind of address again. You mentioned the quote I made about CDCB and how genetic progress has basically doubled since we've had the advent of genomics. And that there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that with genomic testing, it has dramatically shortened the generation interval that we have for our sires. So we can identify better sires much more quickly than we did before when we had to do more of a proving approach to try to get some confidence of the sires we're selecting. But number two, the other thing is that by use of genomic results in the form of selection indices, such as dairy wellness profit dollars, it's allowed us to not only select good sires, but also to apply selective pressure to the females.
Mhm.
And so when we apply selective pressure now, not only on the male, but also on the female, we can enhance the rate of genetic progress within herds, not just in the industry as a whole. So I mentioned selection indices. Selection indices would include obviously dairy wellness profit dollars, which is the one we have, also net merit dollars. And there's some others out there different people use, cheese merit, TPI. There's a lot of them out there. But the idea is that the selection indices take a variety of different traits, pull them together into one number so that it's kind of like buying a mutual fund of stocks versus putting all your money into one particular stock.
Great analogy.
It helps to diversify your risk and it helps to try to ensure continual forward progress across a variety of traits. So Dairy Wellness Profit is it's a proprietary index from Zoetis, but the key behind that is that we're trying to identify traits that are not only associated with good economic outcomes, i.e., pounds of fat and pounds of protein, but also has a lot of emphasis on what we refer to as wellness traits. So, mastitis resistance, lower risk of mastitis, metritis, lower risk of metritis, abortion, calf respiratory. There are a lot of disease traits within dairy wellness profit dollars, DWP, that are important for improving the long-term profitability of your herd. In addition, we've also got fertility information in there. We've got survivability or livability, productive life. So there's a lot of different traits in there. And that's why I chose this selection index as my genomic variable, because I could apply it across each of the outcomes of interest because it contains different factors related to reproduction, related to milk production, and related to survivability. And as we showed within that subset of roughly 40,000 cows, we did see that as DWP increased, we saw that cows were more likely to get pregnant by 90. They were more likely to have more milk by 90. And they were also less likely to leave by 90 days. So our assumptions were correct, and that relationship that we expected did show through in these results within this paper. So that was a nice thing to see.
Okay, as you were looking through these data sets, what were the different measurements that you and your team were really focused on securing from these 60 herds across the nation?
Yeah, so my co-author Steve Eicker and I debate this, discuss this quite a bit, but the primary thing we were interested in was, is there some type of carryover impact between or as a result of longer or shorter days dry and longer or shorter days open? And so we see a lot of studies talk about this and they try to provide some advice about this, but we wanted to really see, could we measure impacts of this or associations of this in the next lactation? Previous days open is simply defined as the interval from calving till she conceived in one lactation. And then as she goes dry, from the day she dries until the day she calves, that's what we refer to as previous days dry. Both of these are referred to as previous, as in the previous lactation, because our outcome of interest is milk production cumulative from calving to 90 days in the subsequent lactation. It's the percent of animals that become pregnant by 90 days in milk in the subsequent lactation. And it's the proportion of animals that leave the herd by either being sold or died in the subsequent lactation. So we're looking at outcomes in one lactation that might be associated with outcomes in the following lactation. So that was really the primary goal. And then there are a lot of other variables that we included as potential, what we refer to as explanatory variables, things that might explain some of the effects not directly attributable to these specific variables of interest.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in and talk about one of those quadratic interactions that you saw on figure 4, looking at the previous day open and the previous days dry. Talk about what that dry period looks like and how we might be guiding our management decisions.
Yeah, so for the listeners that don't see this, I hope they can check out the paper and see this because I'm actually kind of proud of the color coding and the approach we took to doing this. Oftentimes, when we publish work in a scientific journal like the Journal of Dairy Science, we simply report the parameter estimates from the statistical models, and sometimes hard to understand or apply that. So what we did for this particular paper is we plotted previous days open on one axis versus previous days dry on the other axis, and then we simply color coded the outcome of interest, which in this case was cumulative milk by 90 days. And we made it such that green was good and red was bad. And so there's this gradient scale to go from the highest cumulative milk by 90 days to the lowest. And so it allows the reader to look at this image and say, hey, this is pretty easy to see that I look at this chart and see that the highest cumulative milk, the darkest green, is when previous days dry are kind of in that intermediate desired zone and previous days open are low. And whenever we get into short days dry or a longer days dry within the same days open, we get lower performance. And
Mhm.
so that's what this quadratic relationship that we're trying to explain in this color-coded figure. Hopefully, it helps the reader see that a bit easier.
Yeah, I really enjoyed working through this paper. I'm a visual learner, and I think the way that you guys did this graphically with the color differential and the gradients within each color really does drive home exactly what we've seen happen on the farm, right? And so that's really talking about the cumulative milk production, but let's talk a little bit about risk of replacement and focusing in on recorded cases of mastitis in that previous lactation. Could you talk some about what those odds of replacement if she had one case of observed clinical mastitis versus two or more?
And this is where it gets to be a little bit challenging in terms of interpreting observational data. And what I mean by that is if we look at animals that persist and go dry, there are oftentimes animals that have higher milk production that are the ones that had more cases of mastitis. Now, this is where it gets to be interesting. Obviously, having higher milk does not cause an animal necessarily to have more mastitis, but animals that produce more milk have the opportunity to stay in the herd longer because she's more valuable to the producer. Consequently, we'll see those animals have more cases of disease, whether it's mastitis or lameness or whatever the disease of interest is, because we're more, quote unquote, tolerant
Mhm.
of her having that disease. So therefore, we're kind of willing to look the other way sometimes. Now, despite that kind of underlying approach, we saw that animals that had one case in one lactation, they were 20% more likely to leave by 90 days of their following lactation. But animals that had two or more cases, 50% higher odds of removal by 90 days
Mhm.
compared to those animals that did not have mastitis in the previous lactation. So that was a strong predictor of premature removal risk in the following lactation, just one of many that we observed here.
We know as an industry that mastitis just lends itself to lots of headaches, right? And so not only do you have the issue of dumped milk, but we know of the associations with reproduction. And so it makes sense. Everything that you have graphically illustrated makes sense, but it's really robust to see it on a chart in this way, statistically proven to be significantly associated with the other parameter. Just really cool data set. I had a good time with it. I did find myself as I was reading through this paper, a question bubbling up to the top of the surface was, how many sins are we willing to forgive to keep these girls
Right,
in the herd, and where exactly is that break even?
right.
And we can't discount or ignore the market pressures. I mean, it feels like a bit of feast or famine with replacement heifer inventories, right? And under that lens, the data set that you analyzed, I should bring up, was from data pool January of 2018 all the way to May 2024. And so it's capturing some of those management decisions that are occurring on these 60 herds based under those market conditions. And this is totally speculative, and I know it's not appropriate to ask speculation on a scientific podcast here, but where do you think some of this movement would be, or what have you been noticing in herds now that there's so much market pressure? Are you seeing aged cows being retained longer?
Okay, well, that's a really, really interesting question there, Reagan, because that gets to really the reason that Steve and I did this project. There's a lot of buzz in the industry about delaying voluntary waiting period and giving cows longer lactational periods in an effort to extend or enhance productive life or total lifetime spent in the herd.
Right.
And that's where we can get ourselves into trouble pretty quickly. It sounds great on the surface. Everybody thinks if I could get another 3 months or another 6 months or another year, another lactation out of an animal, that's great. But if we gain that as a consequence of improved management and as a consequence of that animal truly representing the best profit potential for the herd, then that's great. But when we set out to keep cows longer for the explicit purpose of extending productive life, we end up keeping cows too long and we end up actually hurting profitability.
Right.
And when we look at the impacts of volunteer waiting period, a lot of this buzz is coming over from Europe, to be honest with you, where there's a lot of infatuation with extreme delays in voluntary wait. I'm talking 120, 150 days in
Oh,
milk
wow.
before they start breeding. Well, there are unintended consequences associated with that. And that's what this paper was trying to identify is when we make a decision to delay breeding on an animal, we are expecting, obviously, to have longer days open because that's part of the design.
Hmm.
Now, the other kind of unintended consequence of that is that when we extend lactation, we have cows that decline in milk to the point where they're no longer profitable to stay in the lactating herd. And so we see cows that must be dried off early
Hmm.
instead of going dry at the appropriate time. And so what that does now is in addition to having longer days open, it extends her time in the dry period. And so that's exactly why we went to try to illustrate or examine what we might see from associations between lactation length and dry period length and subsequent performance.
Yes. As you were working through this data, and you're of course looking at previous days open. So talk to me about how this correlates back to voluntary waiting period. What should guys be doing with that number?
Yeah, so that is actually a really, really interesting point that a lot of people are curious about. I've spent some time the last year investigating what I think would be optimal voluntary waiting period for a number of herds. And every time I look at it, I struggle to find a profitable response associated with delaying voluntary wait excessively. Now, what I mean by that is there are people proposing 90, 100, 120-day voluntary waits, and I think that's a really big mistake.
Hmm.
For me, for most herds in the US that are going to be these high producing confinement based operations, optimal voluntary weight still in that 60 to 70-day range. And sometimes when herds have exquisite control on repro, they may be fine going to 80 days. But I just cannot pencil out a benefit of going beyond that if we truly evaluate the opportunity cost associated with our decisions and look at the carryover effects in the next lactation, for example, which was the subject of this paper. So 60, 70, maybe as high as 80, but not much longer than that.
And any change in that recommendation based on lactation number?
I don't think so. And I know there's some conflicting opinions of that. There are some people that think a first lactation animal, you can afford to delay a little bit. And there's a statement I use in a lot of my presentations, which is just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Right.
And what I mean by that is a first lactation animal does have a more persistent lactation, but her first lactation is significantly less than we expect to see in her second lactation. So again, when we start looking at the time value of an animal and the opportunity cost, I don't want to keep an animal in first lactation for an excessively long period of time.
Right.
I'd like to get her to second lactation. She's going to have higher production and she's going to have actually a very low transition risk going from first to second. So I don't personally like to delay breeding first lactation animals. There's sometimes specific reasons why. If you really truly have very poorly developed heifers prior to first calving, but let's fix that problem and not put a band-aid on it by
Right.
extending the delaying the breeding.
Right. Absolutely. Awesome. Great, great addition. Now, I think something that's going to make everyone smirk a little bit or frustrated, however you want to look at it, but your data supported that we still hate it when cows twin. Those twin events, they averaged about 4% of the time in your massive data set, which is likely what guys are seeing out in the field. What are some other things about twinning or that bull calf versus the heifer that you want to expand upon?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as you said, these are things that we have observed in many herds before, but to see it put together into a large data set and kind of verify our assumptions is kind of neat. So, an animal delivering a male calf, first of all, we saw some slight increases in risk of some outcomes like premature removals, though they were 10% higher odds of leaving early compared to an animal that delivered a heifer calf. A lot of that we think is a consequence of potential differences in gestation length and, of course, differences in birth weight. So that bigger animal at birth has some negative consequences, whether it's increasing risk of retained placenta and dystocia and metritis. But we know they have negative effects not only on early lactation production, but also on reproduction and, as we showed here, risk of premature removal. Now, twins is even more unique because twins is much greater impact than simply a bull calf. And I have to note here that when we looked at twins, we did not differentiate whether it was a twin females, twin males, or male female twins. So any of those were lumped together into the twin category. But animals that deliver twins were almost twice as likely to leave by 90 days compared to an animal that delivered a heifer calf, a single heifer calf. And that's not accounting for live born or stillborn. That's just simply what type of calf was delivered. And again, we know that twins, because of great energetic demands in the last 30 to 60 days of that pregnancy, the effect on her from a metabolic perspective, a greater risk of developing metritis, retained placenta, all those nasty kind of fresh cow disease issues we see. Those are all much higher when we see animals delivering twins compared to a heifer, or in this case, even a male calf. Yeah, this study did go back and confirm all those assumptions we've had and observations we've seen.
Yeah, we just hate it. We hate it. We hate it. I would like to talk a little bit about the risk of pregnancy there on figure 7. As I was reading this graph, we've got previous days dry and previous days open mapped out on the y and x axis just as described before, but the coloration or gradation is all green in the top left corner.
Yep.
And so that's suggesting that if she's only got 20 days dry, um, and bred back at 50 days in milk would be the best scenario for estimating the risk of pregnancy at 90 days in milk. Can you talk me through this graph? This one I struggled to understand.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So when we look at relationships between, say, previous days dry, historically, we've kind of fixated on this idea or came to the conclusion that optimal days dry was somewhere between about 40 and 70 days. And different studies will define that in smaller ranges. That is focused on an all-around performance in the next lactation. Okay. So if you going back to our previous one, looking at cumulative milk in the first 90 days, optimal days dry was closer to 70 than it was to 50 or 60 for milk production in the next lactation.
Hmm.
But now when we look at repro, it goes the other way, that a shorter days dry was associated with a greater proportion of animals pregnant by 90 days. But if we think about that from a metabolic risk, a disease risk for these animals, animals that have very short days dry tend to have fewer metabolic issues early in the next lactation.
Mhm.
Fewer metabolic diseases means that these animals get back onto their feet faster in terms of energy dynamics. They tend to start eating faster, have less of the ketosis related issues, and generally go on and perform better from a reproductive perspective. But that would not be the optimal days dry for milk production in the next
Peak milk.
lactation.
Mhm.
So we have to be careful when you look at one particular outcome, in this case, reproductive performance by 90 days, that we don't lose sight of what the overall most important goal is, which is a combination of success from early performance lactation wise and early performance repro. This is looking at these animals that conceive very early. And this relationship that I'm showing, and you referred to in figure 7, does not necessarily apply to cumulative total pregnancies by, say, 200 or 220 days open. So
Mhm.
we might not see that same really strong relationship to the shortest days dry for the rest of the reproductive performance period. But in the very early stages, that kind of makes biological sense when we think about metabolic risk. Now, we don't want to choose 20 or 30 days dry. I want to make sure the listeners understand we're not talking about that as the best all around goal. The best goal is still going to be somewhere in that 50 to 60 day range of days dry in order to optimize not only future fertility, but also milk production and to decrease the risk of premature removal.
Absolutely. And several times in the paper, you brought up body condition score and monitoring and making sure that that's in alignment and direct response to what you were saying with ketosis and managing that metabolic presence of the cow through that early lactation phase, having lasting implications. And you don't have to scroll along on my podcast page to hear about something associated with the transition cow because I'm just so enamored by that phase of production. Okay, so one question that I love to ask every single author that I interview, if there was one particular thing or one overarching theme that you gathered up from this robust research project that you want boots on the ground dairy producers to take home from your data set, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really interesting question you've got posed there. One of the main things for me that hopefully kind of showed forth in this paper is we're looking at kind of unintended consequences. And one of the things I've been focusing on the last couple of years is helping producers understand some of the economic ramifications of the decisions they make. We, whether it's a veterinarian, nutritionist, other consultant, or even producers, sometimes we get so wrapped up on trying to reduce cost or overly focused simply on production that we don't necessarily entertain the idea of opportunity cost, what might have happened. So, an example might be people focus on reducing the cost of replacement by trying to delay voluntary weight, by trying to extend lactation length, things like that to keep an animal in production longer. Well, it sounds good until we start to consider the unintended consequences. What are the opportunity costs of the decision we're making like this?
Mhm.
And so, what this paper is trying to highlight is right, we can do some things, but if we really want to look at optimal performance goes back to that traditional let's get her pregnant in a timely manner, achieve that 13 and a half month calving interval on average, maintain that 50 or 60-day dry period, because that does appear to be the best overall approach
Mhm.
if you look at all these outcomes altogether. So for me, it's focus on things that you know, but don't forget some of these unintended consequences of decisions we make.
But I guess it's all about management choices and how you go about navigating each one of those, but being aware of what's happening in your barn. There's not necessarily a cookie cutter, perfect slice approach to how to manage through these things, but taking this data from your own herd and applying what you've learned could really help you make better management decisions going.
That's certainly my hope. I hope that people look at this and while it may not exactly match their individual, I think the concepts are sound.
Mhm.
And I think there are some good take-homes people can gather from this. And my hope is it will help producers do a better job of making better prospective decisions moving forward and help improve their bottom line.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Overton, this has been a great discussion, and I really want to thank you for your time. And listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day today to kind of talk through all the risks and rewards of your management decisions and how they relate back to this complicated beast and being successful financially. So I've really enjoyed our conversation, and this has been the March edition of the Dairy Science Digest, which is a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles that are actively in press at the Journal of Dairy Science. It's sound science that you can base your management decisions around, provided to you by your University of Missouri dairy team. So please be sure to share, like, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone.